JuJu, he comes back and plays. I thought that was cool. It was cool, but obviously he wasn't going to make an impact. Any thoughts on him after seeing him in this just very impotent game that the Steelers put together?
Yeah, I mean, it was fun to see him play. Sort of in the same role, a lot of underneath targets. He had 8 targets, 5 catches, 26 yards. I mean, we've seen a lot of that in his final couple of years here in Pittsburgh, where he sees decent volume, but winds up with 26 yards on 5 catches, like he's a running back or like a not particularly athletic tight end line. Even it's almost embarrassing to the tight ends to say that's a tight end line, because most of them are able to do a little bit more per catch than that.
I mean, you watch JuJu and Chase Claypool in this game, and you're really thinking to yourself, where is James Washington? He cannot be worse than these guys.
Right. Yeah, I think JuJu has the potential for a career resurgence. We've talked a lot about it. It's also tough when you look at, we're now years removed from what might have been just a really early and short peak. I think back to the Hakeem Nicks things and some of those types of players that still don't make sense to me. Hakeem Nicks not going on to have a better career doesn't make any sense to me still to this day. He had a very good first couple of years. He looked fantastic. And then just was, he had a foot injury or something, right? But still, just like, I don't know what the long-term upside is for JuJu. I did see that trade offer, and I was, going to chat with you about it. I didn't think that was all that bad, because we have so much 2022 draft capital to get a second-round pick in 2023 and to cut down a player and move off of JuJu. I think I would have been comfortable with that. We're going to try to probably be moving stuff into 2023 anyway. So I thought that was reasonable. Maybe not necessarily the correct value because of the time discount and time delay and all of that, but certainly a reasonable trade that we could have accepted and justified from our position. But yeah, I mean, I do still have some optimism for JuJu. I don't want to just give him away or anything, right? And so it's one of those things where I was just saying sort of all the negative, the down potential for JuJu, that he is sort of this Hakeem Nicks.
I mean, if a team like the Chiefs makes a play on him again this year in free agency, he's got to make that jump, right? I mean, he can't stay there with the Steelers and the quarterback situation they're likely to have.
It's still so hard to understand why he went back. I mean, I was telling myself that there were some types of promises or decisions made that his role wouldn't be the same as last year, but it very clearly was. And he didn't play a lot this year, but you get him in a better situation, right? He showed that explosiveness. The up case is that he literally just turned 25 in November. He's going to be 25 at the start of next season. You have the potential for a second peak. And I know that seems unlikely at this moment, but certainly has a lot of years in front of him if he does sign with a new team, a team that is, this role basically can't get worse. I don't think a new team is going to be likely to use him at such a low ADOT and in such a similar way. Like almost any other team, any other spot you can imagine him being in. He was talking with the Ravens. If he would have signed at the Ravens, they're a little bit more of a vertical passing team. We would have likely seen him have an ADOT in the double digits, probably, I would guess, in that offense. Doesn't mean he would have been great, but it would just be interesting to see him getting into more space downfield in some of his routes and things. I mean, the reality is he's just not running a lot of deep routes, and he has years ahead of him. I don't have a great example, so the one I'm going to pull is Larry Fitzgerald, which isn't a good one necessarily, but he had a span from age 29 to age 31 where it looked like he was pretty much done, because he had 3 straight seasons under 1,000 yards. His yards per reception, yards per target were dropping. He was playing with some bad quarterbacks. The targets were still there. They had kind of fallen off by his age 31 year in 2014. And then things things improved, and he had a resurgence from 2015 to 2017, age 32 to 34. Just an example of a guy who had basically 2 peaks. He had this elite first 7 or 8 years, and then has a 3-year lull where it really looks like he's done. And then for him, it was a lot later in terms of his age curve. He's 32, 33, 34. The reason I say it's not a great example is I don't think we should use this as evidence of anything else, but I just gave sort of the negative Hakeem Nicks. I wanted to at least give one example of a guy who consensus was pretty heavy that he was done, but he had shown obviously in his past that he had the ability to play at a really high level, and he continued to. And he had 3 straight 100-catch seasons, 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons after not having one for 3 years in a row. And so Yeah. Is it that crazy that JuJu could have sort of a second wind, age 25, age 26, age 27, age 28? I mean, no. I mean, he's got 4 more years, solid years, I would say, before we're even talking about him being on the back end of the age curve. So if he comes out this year in a new offense and is in a different role and has just even a solid season, I mean, we're talking positively about Deontay Johnson in a similar light. Deontay Johnson is older than JuJu, has been in the league for a less number of seasons, right? He came in after JuJu, I think 2 years after JuJu, but JuJu was such a young rookie at 21, and Deontay came in at like 23, that Deontay's actually 6 months older. Just where they're at on the age curve is a point I'm trying to make. Certainly, I would rather have Deontay right now. He's been more productive in recent seasons, and that's what we should be looking at the most when projecting ahead. But JuJu, I think, has time where if he rebounds, his value can also rebound, is the main argument I'm trying to make. And so not a guy that I would want to just be cutting and giving up on.
Sure. And I think that with some of the age curve stuff, I mean, a lot of that is you put a lot of the players together. When you look at the individual people, it tends to be these pretty steep declines, and the declines in many cases are related to injury, which JuJu obviously has had. You have guys like Hakeem Nicks, Kenny Britt, the other one who always pops for me. Both of those guys, if they had stayed clean, stayed healthy, I think we would just look at them in a very, very different light, much closer to someone like a Calvin Johnson than what their careers turned out to be, which was nowhere close, right? So you get injured early, you don't necessarily ever come back. One of the things that you mentioned there that's so important, though, is because of his age, if you hit on what's probably a low probability and he does come back, then suddenly the sky is the limit from a trade perspective because he's still going to be so young. And the other thing is when you're talking about people who get hurt and aren't 100% of what they used to be, you really need someone who is just an unbelievable star to be able to take 5-10% off and say, okay, this guy is even still a viable NFL player, much less a fantasy impact player. But he's been so bad for the last couple of years that it's easy to forget that JuJu's first 2 seasons in the NFL were 2 of the best ever. And so that's another way in which if he were to rehab some of the value, then the trade market is going to really shift in a big way because of some of these points about him. And that kind of goes back to this idea of how do you decide to trade certain people? And I think that a lot of times the tendency or the temptation is to trade the guys with a wide range of outcomes because you can't count on them. But the smart thing to do, at least some of the time, is to sell your best players or to sell the players where it's really clear what they're going to give. You get a fair market price for them. And then you keep some of these guys with the wider range because, I mean, you don't want to, there's not a lot gained by selling low on them now or not seeing what that is. And especially if you put your roster together in a way where you do have 10 to 12 really strong players, and then you have 8 to 10 or whatever your roster limits are, but you have these guys to where you've got a decent number of wide range of outcomes options. Now, the thing that you and I are dealing with a little bit in this league is because we traded back so many times, and then we took players with a wide range of outcomes, or they've descended into that. When you think of a guy like Will Fuller, we may have more players in that category right now than we would really prefer, but it is something that we have to look at as we make trades. Is it something where you would actually prefer to trade a Deebo Samuel, even though he's the clear star on the team?
And I think, yeah, potentially, yes, trade Deebo. I think the biggest thing from what you just said that made me realize is I think we do want to hold JuJu. That I mentioned I liked the 2023 2. I think part of that is because I don't think we'll get a 2022 2, and we already have several. So probably the best offer we could expect for a current year pick would be like a 2022 third round pick. We have like almost no value for that because we are loaded up so much with picks. I mean, it's not to say that it wouldn't be valuable, but part of why I liked that 2023 2 is just, we're moving picks into the future. Having said that, I think in other leagues, if you can make, to our listeners, if you could make a deal where you're trading a 2023 2 for JuJu right now, he's probably a pretty strong buy, because I think the other really good point you just made is that he had the great first and second season. He has the production to back it up, where if we do see some positive stuff, and his age is young enough as well, that we are going to see sentiment shift, not to where he's a top 5, dynasty receiver. Again, I think at one point maybe he was, but we will see him rise again in a way that by the time 2023 comes around, he will be worth more than a 2 probably, or at least you'd be able to get that back and have the production in the interim. Now, certainly there's downside as well, but I think it's a bet worth making. Especially, I would also point out, you look at not just those first 2 seasons. He's played 5 years. His third was the first down year, his injury-plagued year with his knee, and Ben got hurt. They played the whole year without Roethlisberger, only played 12 games. And then this past year was also obviously an injury-plagued year. The middle year, 2020, he played 16 games, was not great, but had a 97-catch season with 9 touchdowns. And so, again, the big reason he wasn't great was the yards per catch. It was the role. He only had 831 yards. But if he comes back next year is in a new situation where he shows some of the yards per reception upside again, I mean, really, like you look at it, 15.8, 12.8, 13.1 in his first 3 seasons, and then 8.6 these last 2. So 4+ yards per reception he's dropped off these last 2 years because of that sort of role shift. He goes somewhere else, he starts averaging over 10 yards per reception again and is able to earn targets and actually put up a decent season. People are going to look back actually somewhat favorably, I think, in 2020 and point out the elements. I mean, I think I would point out the elements where, there were still targets there. There were still receptions. He was able to actually score. The fact that we've seen him be a guy who can find the end zone. He's certainly not someone that we'd sit there and go, yeah, he's going to need to be a low target rate or touchdown rate type of projection if he's at least seeing some air yards, because he has some yak ability. He has some of that stuff. So we get some other stuff in his profile. We get him getting some catches down the field again. Obviously, we'll be able to look back to the first 2 seasons and say, well, this is, maybe a second win where we can see some production like this. But you can also even look at that one other healthy year he's had in the last 3 and say there were some positive elements there too. I think he'd be viewed very favorably. Let's say if he landed somewhere else and had a 1,000-yard season this coming season. And so I don't know. What do you think? Do you think if you're in a league where you're looking for guys who could gain value that you would give up a 2023 second round pick to acquire JuJu?
I might not, but it's because of the structure of those rosters. I think it's a good, and the way that I like to play it, but I think it's a good move. Obviously, I don't think you'll get it unless you're in a league where the quarterbacks are very important and make that second round pick more valuable. But, those things you said and the touchdowns that you mentioned, we know the touchdowns are going to be all over the place, but I would think that his best fit and some of the teams that were after him last year are these playoff contenders with good quarterbacks who need a possession receiver, who need a second or third touchdown threat. If you have him, you almost have to hold him until you at least see where he's going to go, or if you get a great offer. But because if he's back in an environment, well, you mentioned the yards per reception. I think that's a great point. I guess my skepticism about his ability to separate or create the type of, run the type of routes, create the type of plays that will allow him to really juice that again. I may be more worried about that than his ability to be an underneath guy, but also an underneath guy with the size and physicality who can be a threat in the red zone. And know that if you play with a Patrick Mahomes or an Aaron Rodgers or some of these kind of guys, including some of the rising younger QBs, you could be in a situation there where you score a bunch of points. One of the reasons why those Chargers players were so interesting this season was they just didn't have the depth that you would expect from, or that you would need to have for the top guys not to be so valuable with a Justin Herbert. So yeah, you could get into a situation where you're playing in a Denver Broncos type of environment where, you'd almost be a straight release kind of player. Fortunately, you're not going to be exactly the Denver Broncos because they've made their big bet with Tim Patrick. But, it's going to be very context dependent with a guy like JuJu, but for the reasons that you mentioned, I think that you have to hold and look and see where it could be. I think that we're at a place where the floor is not going to get a lot lower, but the ceiling could really jump in the offseason here.